Day 4 of the Cairns Cup saw a clear leader emerge for the first time in the event as the current Women's World Championship challenger Tan Zhongyi defeated the returning champion Anna Zatonskih to surge ahead of the pack with 3 out of 4. Jumping into the day's results, in addition to Tan defeating Zatonskih, we also had Alice Lee beating former Women's World Champion Alexandra Kosteniuk with the black pieces. Meanwhile, Harika versus Krush, Paehtz against Mariya Muzychuk, and Dzagnidze versus Anna Muzychuk all ended in draws, with Dzagnidze spoiling a big chance in her game. Heading into tomorrow's round 5, Tan Zhongyi stands alone at the top with 3 out of 4, with Mariya Muzychuk and Harika Dronavalli a half-point behind on 2.5. Going into the games, we'll start with Tan's victory over Zatonskih, which started off as a classical French bishop to g5, takes on e4, knight e4, bishop e7, and here white decides to trade twice on f6. After knight f3, castles, knight takes f6 check, queen takes f6, bishop to d3, and this is generally considered pretty solid for black, but after c5, d takes c5, a very aggressive approach, queen takes b2, castles, Tan goes all in for the attack here. As white's pawns on the queen side are very, very weak, black is very likely going to pick up the c pawn, so this is actually just a pure pawn sacrifice. In fact, rook to b1, sacrificing the a2 pawn already. Note that the c5 pawn is also going to be lost, which will make 2 pawns, but now rook to b4, preparing to swing the rook over to the king side, either rook h4 or rook to g4 coming. Queen to d5, rook to e1, getting the second rook in, and now h6. Probably black should have played queen takes c5, just grabbing this pawn and getting the queen off of any potential attacks on the d-file. The engines do like black here, but of course it's a very, very sharp position. White is 2 pawns down and has very clear attacking chances on the king side. Instead, we saw h6, queen to d2, and now knight takes c5, and this ends up being the losing mistake. Once again, queen takes c5 was needed. The problem with knight takes c5 is that this allows white's rook to come in with rook to e5, now queen to c6, and rook to g4. And white's attack here at this point is very, very strong. Black had to play f5 at this point, allowing queen takes h6. There's just no way to get around this, and then rook to f7. But white would have a very, very strong attack here, basically a winning position if white plays perfectly. Instead, we saw the move knight takes d3, a very unfortunate blunder from Zatonskih, as this just ends the game after queen takes h6. White doesn't recapture the knight, just grabs this pawn threatening mate, and now it's just a mating attack on the board. g6 was played, but rook takes g6 is the finish. Takes, queen takes g6 check, and black resigned after king h8 as rook h5 with mate on the board. So an excellent win by Tan Zhongyi, who moves into the sole lead with this victory. Going on to the other decisive game of the round, this was the game between Alexandra Kosteniuk against Alice Lee. In this one, Alice plays her usual Petrov defense, and this one actually ended up being very, very sharp right from the opening, as Kosteniuk chooses one of the most challenging lines, starting with queen to d2 and queen side castling. Knight c5, h4. Both players were continuing to play rather quickly here, especially white. Knight to g5. At this point, Alice starts spending some time, h6, and now bishop to c4, blitzed out by Kosteniuk. She played this one very, very quickly, indicating that she was still in her preparation. And indeed, this knight on g5, it's very, very dangerous for black to take this one. After h takes g, white is going to double rooks on the h-file and basically has a mating attack going. And this is very, very difficult for black to defend. So instead, Alice plays the move bishop to e6, looking to limit the damage. Knight takes e6, grabbing the bishop pair, knight takes e6, and white is definitely better here. Even a simple move like king to b1, white has a nice advantage. Kosteniuk decides to trade on e6 and play king to b1. White is also better here in this middle game, although it's definitely not that easy for white to play this position. So queen e4, rook to f7, both sides looking to improve their chances. Now c4, rook to b8, bishop e3, and b5. Alice plays for counterplay on the queen side. Now at this point, Kosteniuk takes, probably this was a pretty serious mistake. Instead, she had the chance to go c5, sacrificing the pawn, but the point is that black's queenside play would be completely blocked. Black's pieces really have no activity here. White can continue g4 followed by g5 and have all the attacking chances in the world. The engines really find this quite promising for white. I think this was the way to go. In the game after takes, now black gets some nice counterplay on the b file. c4 was another mistake, I believe, here from white, is after rook to b4, queen c2, c5, black's queen is coming to a6 with easy counterplay against this weak pawn. In fact, this is what happened. g4, queen a6. At this point, white should just play g5, give up the c-pawn, and look to attack on the king side. Instead, we saw b3, but now d5, and black is just breaking through here. The initiative has completely turned around. Takes on d5 was seen in the game. Now c4, Alice just going full steam ahead, looking to open up white's king. Bishop f6 is coming, and there's a mate threat on a1. So g5 played now, stopping bishop f6, but e takes d5, rook h3, white desperately trying to defend the queen side, but now queen to e6. Alice's play in this part of the game was very, very nice, going for the attack on the rook. Rook to g3, bishop d6, getting the bishop to this nasty diagonal with tempo, f4, and now rook to c7. Now white stopped this one for now, but pay attention to the next couple moves. Takes on h6, takes on b3, queen to g6, looking for any kind of counterplay against black's king, but black is first. B takes a2 check. Now king to a1, hoping to hide the king behind this a-pawn, and bishop e5 check. Black's pieces come in for the kill. Now if takes, queen takes e5, and white is getting mated on b2. They can try something like rook to d4. Black can take on d4, and black is just winning this one as g7 is defended. Everything is covered by black's pieces, and it's white's king that is soon going to be getting mated. So after bishop e5 check, Kosteniuk played king takes a2, but now rook to b2 check, king back to a1, and rook d2 check. Simple finish for black using the discovered attack, picking up the rook on d1, and after takes, Kosteniuk did resign as mate is incoming here on b2. So an excellent win for Alice, who gets back to an even score, and Kosteniuk drops down to an even score for winning her first game, losing her second game, winning her third game, and now losing her fourth game. So very up and down event for Kosteniuk so far. Moving on to the next game between Harika against Krush. This one started off as a Sveshnikov Sicilian. Open Sicilian here, knight d5, knight db5, d6, bishop to g5, and the two players go down a fairly theoretical line, except here after c3, rook b8, knight c2, bishop to g5. This is a well-known position. a4 is the main move. Here Harika plays the move h4 after a pretty quick thought, 1 minute. But it turns out this move might not be the right move in this position. In fact, black can probably should go ahead and take this pawn. Bishop takes h4. There's nothing immediate here with queen h5 since black's king is not castled. However, Irina either fell for the bluff or decided it wasn't worth the risk, goes bishop h6, and now white actually gets quite a nice version of this position, and Harika definitely ends up with an advantage. So g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop to b7. Both sides continue normally here. We have the exchange of knights. Castles, rook fc8, knight to b4, and now white just has a nice strategic edge here. Good control over the d5 square and clear play against this weakness on b5. So rook a5, queen to d8, rook a1, bishop f8. At this point, maybe white could have actually just grabbed this pawn. This was an interesting approach. After takes, black would win back the pawn with bishop takes e4. But white can drop back, takes on g2, king takes g2. It seems like white would have good chances in this position with a good knight against bad bishop. Now knight c6 is a threat. White also wants to come back with knight to d5. And it looks like white's chances here are quite reasonable. Instead, we saw queen to d1, rook a8. We see one pair of rooks come off the board, rook a7, rook to c7. And now queen a1. Harika allows the exchange of the second pair of rooks, and this is probably where she gives up her chance to fight for the advantage. Instead, rook to a5, I think white keeps an edge here. The queen can come back to a1, and the pawn on b5 is a long-term weakness. In the game, after queen a1, black trades on a7, queen takes a7, and now fantastic move from Irina, d5. Sacrificing a pawn in order to open up the two bishops, especially the dark squared bishop, which is looking to either take on b4, or in the game, after knight takes d5, takes, black goes b4, and black has sacrificed a pawn here but has reached an endgame with opposite color bishops and has a very, very nice blockade on the dark squares. So fantastic defensive concept here by Irina, sacrificing a pawn even though she really didn't have to, but achieves a very, very holdable position. So queen b7, queen a5, takes. White decides to go for the pure opposite color bishop endgame, but here black's king is very close to the center of the board, and white's extra pawn here really is hard to do much with. So the two players continue to make some moves here, but now f5, nice way to trade a couple more pawns, and soon this game was had ended in a draw. Going on to the next game between Paehtz and Mariya Muzychuk, this one was quite an interesting encounter. Paehtz going for this early queen a4, allowing black to push forward and gain some early space with d4, and we get kind of a reverse Benoni type of structure in this one. And here Paehtz goes e3 very early. This might not have been best. The engines definitely don't like this structure for white, and in fact it does turn out that black gets a nice position in this game. Now c5, knight to b4, and white is already a little bit on the back foot in terms of the structure. Ends up playing e4 here and ceding the d4 square to black's knight. Of course, white does get knight to d5, but black is able to immediately trade this one off and force white to put a pawn here. And at this point, black definitely is doing well in this game with a clear strategic advantage. Knight to b3, rook c8. White even looks for repetition here, but queen to b6, black doesn't allow it. So yeah, black was doing well in this one. h5, rook c1, king h7. I think at this point, oops, let me go back. After king to h7 instead, black could have played f5 and I think is doing quite well in this position. But we saw king h7 trade on d4. At this point, c takes d4. Black again has a clear edge. Instead, we saw e takes d4. And at this point, Muzychuk does kind of start to drift a bit, not seeing a clear plan in her position. She goes b4, a4, allowing white to close up the queen side completely, and this starts to go in white's favor as the position definitely turns. Now bishop f4, hg, f6, and nice move from Paehtz, bishop h3. The idea to play queen h2 in case black takes this bishop, winning back the bishop and trading off white's bad light squared bishop. So definitely an achievement here for white. Now at this point, black probably should have taken on f4, and the position remains roughly equal. But instead we saw bishop takes h3, queen h2, king g7, queen takes h3, and now it's actually white that is better. The queen is very nice on g4. White is in control of the king side and starts to slowly build up here. Now the game had a couple of twists and turns. After rook f5, takes, black had this chance here to play queen to d7, and this would have at least given black a very safe position. The point is that white is pinned up, and it's hard to break this pin. If white plays rook f4 at any moment, well then black can trade queens, and after rook takes g4, g5, white's rook would actually be trapped on g4. This position is actually quite bad for white. If e5, for example, trying to break free, then black has f5, rook takes g5, check, king h6. Nice trick here, and white's rook ends up lost. Now white doesn't have to move the rook after queen to d7, but then white would be basically stuck with the two pieces and black would be totally fine. Instead, rook e8 was played, rook f4, and now white continues to build up here with queen f4, queen e7, g4, queen e5. And at this point, Paehtz decides to trade on e5, take on f7, play g5, essentially a draw offer as this king and pawn endgame is completely drawn, and the two players did repeat moves very soon. However, maybe not the best decision. After queen to g3, the engines definitely like white's chances here with the plan of playing king to g2, queen h4, and then rook h3, just attacking on the h-file. So maybe a missed chance for Paehtz in this one. If black trades queens on g3, then after king takes g3, it's definitely a nice rook and pawn endgame for white, as white has the nice pass pawn on d5. The king can come in, and there's also this break with g5 available in the future to make a second passed pawn. So this game does end in a draw after the players go into a king and pawn endgame. Going to our last game between Nana Dzagnidze against Anna Muzychuk. This one started off as a Queen's Gambit declined with an early c6 known as the triangle system. White trades on d5, and pretty quickly we get a very classic structure here known as the Carlsbad structure. Very equal position so far. Neither side has any real advantage in the position, just very, very close to equal. We get the trade of bishops here, knight to e5, knight to d3. But eventually what happens here is white builds up on the e-file, the rook e2, rook d1, and Muzychuk plays quite provocatively here, putting both rooks on the a-file. Well, Nana picks up the gauntlet, goes e4, opening up the center at the cost of her d-pawn, but she correctly judges that the activity for white here is definitely worth it. Now black has to bring the pieces back to the center, knight c5, takes, rook f8, queen to c4, but it's clear that white has a bit of an advantage here with the two rooks doubled up on the e-file and black's rook still needing to get back in the game. So we see queen g5, a3, rook e4, eventually knight b4, trading off the knight on d5, knight to d3 back, knight b4 again, rook e5, finally forcing black to move this one. And now takes, rook to d7, rook e7, white goes for the 7th rank, takes. Now surprisingly the best move for black was queen takes b2 here, allowing queen takes f7 check, and after king h8, g7 is defended, and white might have to give a perpetual check because otherwise black's a-pawn is way too strong. But of course very, very scary to allow this on the black side. So instead queen f5 was played, but now queen to d4 and white takes control over the position. Muzychuk tries a3, takes to get some counterplay, but rook takes b7, and just like that, white is now a pawn up. And at this point, Dzagnidze plays for the conversion and does a pretty good job. Brings the rook back to e2. Now I think black should have kept the rooks on the board. Instead, we see a trade. After queen takes e2, queen to d4, queen e8 check, queen takes f7, queen takes b4. The players reach this queen and pawn endgame, which does seem to be very, very promising for white. Now she went check and queen to e5. It was also possible to give check and then pick up the c6 pawn, queen c8, and taking this one. Likely white didn't want to give up the pawn on f4 with check, but then the king does start to walk out, and it doesn't seem like black has a perpetual there, so maybe white could have grabbed this pawn right away. Instead, Dzagnidze plays it a bit slower with queen to e5 and h4, also a very, very reasonable approach, gaining space first before eventually bringing the king out in order to help the queen try to pick up this pawn. And to her credit, she's able to create some very serious winning chances here. After lots of maneuvering, at this point the players are definitely in big time trouble. They're just relying on the 30-second increment for the rest of the game, with a couple minutes maximum for the rest of the game. So checks along the way. White's king finally starts to come in at the cost of the h-pawn, but now the king gets dangerously close to black's c-pawn, and she is able to win this one. She gives up the g-pawn, but the c-pawn here is very, very strong. Now queen f3 check is played, and king to b6, definitely a slip. After king to c7, black has no more checks, and now c6 is going to be pushed. Of course, black has the h-pawn that can try to create some counterplay, but white's c-pawn is much closer to the promotion square, and with best play, white should be winning from here. Instead, we saw king b6, allowing a couple more checks, and queen to b7, now queen d6, another check. Eventually, what happens is white does have to give up the f-pawn in order to push c6. This is still very, very nice for white, but of course, she's now given up the f-pawn as well. More checks, queen c7, and now h5. And finally, Muzychuk takes her chance, now that the pawn is blocked, to try and create some counterplay. At this point, Dzagnidze goes wrong with the move queen to d5. But this is definitely where white starts to lose her winning advantage. Queen to d7 would have still kept a winning position for white. After queen e5 check, queen e7 is the key, and it's very, very hard for black to hold this one. For example, if they give another check, well then queen to d8, and then the next time white's king moves, it's going to be a discover check against the king on h8. And so that's a very, very key tempo that white wins here. And then as soon as the checks run out, of course, white is pushing the c-pawn forward and promoting. So this one likely would have been winning. Black can, of course, keep fighting with queen to b5. But for example, white can play queen to e4, stopping the h-pawn, and then getting ready to bring the king back and eventually advance the c-pawn further. Queen endgames are very, very tough. No telling what would happen from this point, but queen d7 was definitely white's best chance to win this game. Instead, we saw queen to d5, but now h4, and already it seems like white is not winning this one as black's counterplay is getting too strong. So we see a couple checks trying to gain time, king f8 threatening checkmate, but queen f4, And at this point, Muzychuk defends this one very, very well, giving lots and lots of checks and then pushing the pawn on h3. And now white is simply just not in time. Queen to b6, pinning the pawn. White gives some more checks. C-pawn is hanging. Queen to d5, queen back to c7. And yeah, this h-pawn is just way too annoying. And finally, Dzagnidze does give it up, decides to repeat moves, make a perpetual check, and a draw was agreed. So very, very big endgame battle. Definitely a missed chance for Dzagnidze, as she could have won this one, but the game does end in a draw. That brings us into tomorrow's round 5, where we got a number of interesting matchups. Anna Muzychuk playing white against Tan Zhongyi, Mariya Muzychuk white against Harika Dronavalli, Alice Lee white against Nana Dzagnidze, Krush white against Kosteniuk, and Zatonskih white against Paehtz. It's going to be another very, very exciting round, and hopefully I'll see you folks back here for the recap. Until then, take care.